to launch our Wednesday seminar series today. I'm really delighted that we have a distinguished alumnus today, Saleem Ali. For those of you who are not familiar with his work, Saleem is an environmental planner, and his work focuses on resolving environmental ecological conflicts, but he also works at the interface of governments and corporations and local communities as well. He currently holds the Blue and Gold Distinguished Professorship in Energy and Environment at the University of Delaware. He is also a senior fellow at Columbia University Center for Sustainable Investment and also at Georgetown University Center for Australia, New Zealand, and Pacific Studies. In addition to that, so you have to keep in track, he holds a position at University of Delaware. He has these senior fellowships at Columbia, Georgetown. He also has held the chair in Sustainable Resources Development at the University of Queensland's Sustainable Minerals Institute in Brisbane, Australia, where he still holds an affiliation. And before he moved to Australia, where he was for 5 years, he was a professor of environmental studies at the University of Vermont's Rubenstein School of Natural Resources, where he was the founding director of the Institute for Environmental Diplomacy and Security. So Saleem started off his career thinking he might be a chemist. He got a chemistry degree out of Tufts, and then he came here, and I guess his world was shaken up. He came here, and he ended up doing a master's degree working with Dan, and his thesis was entitled Water and Diamonds, Resource Scarcity and Environmental Degradation in Southern Africa. And I think if you look at his CV and where he's published and what he's published on, that clearly launched a career in issues around mineral supply, diplomacy, governance. He left Yale and then went up to MIT, where he got a master's, a PhD in environmental planning from the Department of Urban Studies and Planning. His dissertation was entitled Environmental Resistance and Aboriginal Development, a Comparative Study of Mining Ventures in the United States and Canada. One thing I think particularly interesting, there are many things interesting about Saleem's CV, but one thing that's really interesting is he's probably one of the few people who has published in the Journal of Bioeconomics, Journal of Sustainable Development, as well as Nature, on a variety of topics. He also publishes quite a bit in terms of book formats as well, so he's incredibly prolific. He also is a citizen of the United States, Pakistan, and Australia, so we were joking that he can actually affect governments legitimately in 3 countries. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Saleem Ali.
Thank you so much, Karen, for the generous introduction. It's always a pleasure to be back at Yale, and especially at the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. It's out of my 3 alma maters, I say this quite unabashedly, that this was the place which held the deepest affection for me, whether I blame that on the MODS 3 weeks experience or the time spent in Sage Hall sweltering without air conditioning, or it was a wonderful time, really. And I'm really grateful to especially my mentors here, Dan Esty, who's kindly in the audience as well. Dan was starting his academic career at the time I started. 22 years, can you believe it, when I graduated in class of 96. And I've followed the work here. It's just fantastic. The industrial ecology program has flourished. I was in the first class that was taught in industrial ecology that Tom Gradle used to commute from New Jersey to teach when he worked at Bell Labs with Brad Allenby. And so, I've seen the program develop in a new trajectory from, of course, the very distinguished lineage historically, but moving towards more integration with business and the environment. And so what I'm going to do in my presentation today is to try and make those connections, and I'm approaching this seminar with a degree of humility given the venue. My goal is really to make this a process of exploring some new work with you. So this is the first time I'm making this particular presentation. There's no recycled presentations. I wouldn't do that to my alma mater, I'm really using this opportunity to share some new ideas building on some recent work and to make connections, especially since Karen invited me with some of her work, which is very focused on cities, and also make some connections with distinguished visitors who are here, Mark Swilling from South Africa, as well as Professor Shanhai Zheng from Tsinghua University, with whom I've also had a chance to connect, and I'm delighted that they are visiting Yale this year. So I've deliberately crafted the presentation with all these elements in mind. My contact details are there if you're so interested to connect with me by email or through Twitter, which has become more relevant these days in various ways. So let's start off with the whole notion of cities and sustainability. Since I thought there would be many students also in the audience, some of this may seem a bit elementary for some of you, but I think it's important to put us on the same page. So, cities and sustainability, this has been a challenge for many people to reconcile with in terms of the paradoxes of cities and sustainability. So I've just laid out some points why it's so important to think of cities as the locus of sustainability. So here we have, the first point is, there is a concentration, of course, that happens with cities in wealth and population. That intensity itself has certain implications for sustainability. Cities are also places where you have networks emerging. And so networks are, as we know from the literature, in terms of innovation, are really important in terms of spurring innovation. So cities have that important element to them as engines of innovation, and we know about research clusters and so on from places like Silicon Valley that emerge out of that. Thirdly, the centralization can also lead to more efficiency, and this is where my work, particularly around mineral usage, becomes much more relevant. That you have more efficient uses of transportation system, and potentially also there can be more efficient resource distribution. And certainly a city like New Haven, we often talk about inequality and issues around particularly environmental justice, but the fact is that cities create proximity if they're particularly managed in ways that are around that. And we know about certain policies which can encourage that in terms of rent and land acquisition and real estate. But that's a very important physical factor of cities, which even the fact that many cities are still highly stratified, the physical proximity creates opportunities for them, at least being less so. Fourthly, we have the whole role of cities as incubators of experiments in planning and design. And I chose to do my PhD in planning because I tend to be a very prospective person in terms of how I think. So I'm always thinking about the future, and planning allowed me to do that much more so, to be more experimental. And geography and planning in that way are, somewhat sister disciplines, but geography perhaps can be more retrospective, and planning is a bit more prospective, though there tends to be much more of a blending of late. So now my tenure is in a geography department, but I see myself very much as a planner because of this role that cities can play. And that's why often you have planning departments which are departments of urban planning, or they put in regional planning with it. But it's because of that incubator role of cities which can then be upscaled into other kinds of planning paradigms as well. And then finally, cities are heterogeneous in terms of ethnicity and talent, usually speaking. Not always the case, and certainly in South Africa, sadly, because of social engineering, that was not the case in many instances. But in contemporary cities, if we have the right framework of governance and deliberative democracy, they can be very heterogeneous and hence significant. So this is why cities are important in terms of our understanding of sustainability. Now, the other aspect is, of course, to keep in mind as we go into this discourse is that the rising tide of cities is absolutely inescapable in global sustainability discourse. And this is just a simple diagram from the UN World Urbanization Prospectus to show you what has been happening historically in terms of rural-urban divide. And there is no doubt that urbanization to a large degree an irrevocable trend, even though we have suburbanization also a factor that is playing a role at the same time. So there's core urban development, but also a lot of the suburban development happening. But at the same time, there is no doubt there's a rural migration trend that cannot be escaped. So that all these factors make this aspect of sustainability particularly significant. So my fundamental research questions for this particular endeavor stem from this notion of smart cities being developed across the world, and the notion of smart and how we may unpack this, quite literally how we unpack the smart city. The term smart, I will define it because there are several definitions of smart cities, and I'll define it in a bit from what I consider to be an appropriate definition. But basically, I'm looking at the digital architecture of smart cities and how to optimally reconcile this with material needs in developing the infrastructure to make them smart. So the digital needs of smart cities have certain material needs as well. And how do we address that? And my concern has been, and I'll share some data with you of some recent work from others, which shows that this has been a neglected aspect. And some of the leading lights and the most influential works on smart cities have neglected the material needs of infrastructure which are needed for that. The second question, which is more embedded, and this is more the social science question, and I'll be talking to your PhD students later, one of the key things we always learned in our doctoral seminar at MIT was the kind of questions we asked, the why versus the how questions. The why questions are often the most interesting ones. Engineers tend not to ask them. They usually tend to ask more the how questions, but both are important. I think they complement each other. So the why question is, why have smart city innovators neglected to account for the material needs of such a techno-urban transition? There is some assumption that is embedded in there that materials will become available. We often used to think of that assumption in terms of water, and that's why I was initially interested in water. When I did my first degree here was on more around water issues, but then I moved more towards minerals because part of my concern was ultimately the elements, my chemical roots coming to bear in this regard as well, that the elements and the material needs of society are going to be ultimately determinant of even energy infrastructure as well as water infrastructure. So this is the question is, why is it neglected? Somehow there is this aspect of development that is not given as much attention. Now, Karen was mentioning the Nature paper we published last year. We tried to get at this question broadly in terms of the climate change debate. So this is just to give you an example of how mineral supply issues are neglected. So, Paris climate change targets have been ordained in certain ways that countries have embraced them, but there has been absolutely no attention paid in the international policy realm about how are we going to meet those targets from a material perspective. If we're going to have solar energy infrastructure, wind energy infrastructure, and so on, there are certain material needs for that. And how are we going to meet that? So this is just, one diagram that this is not the exact diagram in the paper, but it's a slightly more refined version of that, where we're looking at some of these projections just around copper production, and that's why you've got Chile so prominent in this, because it's world's largest copper producer. But we know that there's going to be a shortfall just for copper, and copper is like an old world metal, right? It's not like, we're not talking about exotic metals of neodymium and europium and so on. We're talking about an old world metal, which is still, and people often thought that copper is not going to be as important. Remember, we had all kinds, copper has been maligned in different ways. If you had the famous bet between Julian Simon and Paul Ehrlich that we'd run out of copper, and of course, we know that Paul Ehrlich lost that bet, and the late Julian Simon won the bet because we didn't run out of copper by the time that he said we would. But the reality is, so that part was wrong too, that there was more copper supply than we thought. But the other part has also been wrong, where people often thought that we would transition from copper to other materials, right? And we thought we would have, with fiber optics, we would not need copper as much. And so there was that presumption. And there are certain biophysical limits in terms of what we can do with the kinds of needs we have for whether it's transporting electrons for electricity or other kinds of biotic systems as well, where we do need certain kinds of properties. So this is just to show that we have not thought about it. And in this paper, we make the case that there needs to be a global governance mechanism around mineral supply if we are to meet those international treaty obligations such as the Paris Agreement. So this is just an example of one way in which we can think about it. Now let's think about cities. And I'm also honored to be part of the UN International Resource Panel that we have, Tom Gradle and Mark Swilling and Reed Lifset are all part of that as well, and Edgar Hertwich as well. So one of the signature reports of the panel recently has been on cities, and this was one of the inspirations for me thinking about this research topic. So this report just came out, and Mark is here. I'm sure he can comment on. He was one of he was the lead author on this particular report. But basically, the case that is being made is that cities have a huge infrastructure need, and the way in which they're being developed is not necessarily sustainable. And the report goes into how we could extract more sustainable potential from existing cities' infrastructure. And here, this is one of the diagrams that was presented also in the policy summary of the report, which was sent to the UN member states. And essentially, when it comes to land, metal, water, and climate, we do have potential. Even if we look at resource efficiency and densification targets and other mechanisms, you can have considerable potential for making cities greener. But that is not what is being done currently. So this report is a very important starting point for us to think globally about these questions. It's a very normative report in terms of how it, and that makes it somewhat controversial perhaps too for some, but it's a good starting point for us to think about these issues and present some really robust data compiled over a period of several years to think through what it makes to have a sustainable transition to urban living. Now, the other report that I find as an inspiration for this kind of work, but also one which is disquieting, is a report from McKinsey that came out just June of this year. And this is a report on smart cities. Particularly, the McKinsey Global Institute does these, large sort of long-term study reports, often in partnership with groups like the World Economic Forum. And in this one, they laid out what would happen with a smart city transition. And what I would, urge you to pay attention to is this aspect here with, if we're going to have environmental quality also improved across the board, we could have greenhouse gas emissions reductions, water consumption reductions, so on. This is a little bit less than what is presented in terms of benefits, but they're different metrics, so it's hard to compare with the weight of cities. But some of them could be comparable. The underlying metrics are slightly different. But what I find interesting is that the material needs of any of this is completely absent from the entire report. So there is all this effort being put forward by one of the world's leading management consulting firms, working with a range of industry partners, but there has been no mention of really what would be the material needs of moving towards this smart city transition. And smart cities, going back to that definition of more infrastructure being sustainable. So the smart city transition to some degree is happening already. So this is the other important feature of the McKinsey report is that cities are already moving towards some of these features. And they've focused particularly on these characteristics, the 5 characteristics noted. So transport or mobility, which is a better term to be used, since you don't necessarily need to physically transport if you can have like digital offices and so on. Security, utilities, healthcare, and economic development. And surprisingly, you have cities like New York, which come out really high on this metric, and the other players are probably more known in terms of their sustainability drives, like Seoul and Singapore. But you also have some surprises in terms of what is happening in terms of uptake. So you may have the infrastructure being set up, and this is the engineering side of the story, right? But if you look at the second analysis that they did, which is the uptake of that technology, you come out with a very different story. And this is also something that, for me, that second question, the why question, is important to address as well. So here you've got cities like San Francisco, much more awareness than New York, relatively speaking. So maximum score here is 30 points. In the previous one, it was 55 points. So it's still a ways to go in terms of reaching the McKinsey target for maximum score. But here, the other thing which is interesting is the connection to smartphones was made by McKinsey as a key part of the infrastructure that is needed to have smart cities. And so the orange cities are the ones where you don't have you have less than 60% smartphone prevalence in the city. So Cape Town, Nairobi, Lagos, which are trying a lot of the smart city interface, they do not have the smartphone penetration. And certainly India does not have it either, and neither does Indonesia. So you've got the 3 Indian cities there and Jakarta, which are not there. Now, here the story is interestingly different, where what really shocked me was Moscow has the highest sort of level of awareness in Europe in terms of smart city awareness, usage, satisfaction. So, again, there's some disconnect going on here between the physical infrastructure and the social uptake. And this will, from a material research perspective, this is very important because, when you put in material infrastructure and it is not used, that redundancy leads to a lot of problems, because redundancy means that you have more wear and tear. You're not going to actually be able to have that material useful. It's just sort of a lost investment. So this is going to be another area potentially for much more research that I would like to pursue in this regard. Now, let's step back now to how then, given all this that's going on, how might we think about smart? So one of the key phrases from the Weight of Cities report was smart does not mean sustainable. And absolutely, smart, because of the way smart is used in terms of our work with the digital technology industry, smart gets tied in with a lot of gizmos and technology elements that are not necessarily making the city sustainable. They could, but this is the definition which came forward from the International Telecommunications Union. Again, smartphones are so seminal to making smart cities work. This is the definition they came up with, and I think this is probably good because it deals with some of these other issues too, right? It's bringing in the aspect of efficiency of urban operations while ensuring that it meets the needs of present and future generations. So there's the intergenerational equity element that is brought into this definition. And that's the one I would go with if you really want a smart city in the most inclusive sense of the term. I'm also a traditionalist, so I think we can actually go to smart cities and urban design to go back to some of the classics, which I hope some of our students here at FES are still reading, works like Design with Nature, the classic Ian McHarg work, as well as some of the works on green urbanism. And, a lot of that material, these are some of those key highlights of the insights from those works, are still as relevant for having smart cities work. The capital of one of my countries of citizenship, Islamabad, was designed by the great Greek urban planner Konstantinos Doxiadis. And Doxiadis had a great vision of, green urban planning, which was going back to the 50s and 60s, and still is very relevant today. Islamabad is actually, now they're trying to make it a more sustainable city, and the fact that the infrastructure was laid out the way Doxiadis did, with polycentric planning around, commercial, residential, mixed use, it has led to it being much easier to do than it would be in another context. So don't forget the old classics as well. There's always there's always wisdom to go back to, and you don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel if you've got some of those important insights already there. Now, so how can we go about some further research in this area that I'm beginning to start to pursue now? So, let's look at, first of all, the major material stocks in cities from different perspectives. And this is one inventory approach that it comes from a recent paper from Resource Conservation Recycling that is probably worthwhile considering. Here, now there's some imponderables here that maybe people at FES can help with. But you've got clearly, this is the basic kind of infrastructure, the old world infrastructure, right? In terms of buildings, railways, and so on. But there's going to be a new layer to this from the smart cities infrastructure, and we'll come to that in a moment. But these materials here, all of these, they all have mineral elements and aspects to them where what will be needed to produce each of these. But this one, wood, is particularly interesting because there has been a suggestion that the large-scale infrastructure of cities could be made more from wood, and especially finding ways of laminates and so on. I know Tom Gradle at one of his recent presentations at IRP suggested that we should be thinking more in terms of wood, the new kinds of wood technology. I think it'll be interesting to have more detailed LCAs and so on of what would happen with that. But I don't know much about where things are going with this, but I just wanted to put that in as a teaser because I do find that wood has potential, but certainly it will not be, substitutable in many different kinds of, clearly you can't make sensors for the Internet of Things out of wood, so there will be some aspects of it which are not. But the large building infrastructure, it has been brought up that we should be thinking more in terms of wood again. So now we have to add the smart digital layers to this. And this is coming from the United Nations. Actually, in 2016, they did a whole report on smart cities. And it's focused on this notion of smart digital layers. And this is what they put forward. So, you've got the urban layer itself with smart waste management systems, grids, utilities. The sensors are a key part of it, and this is where the rare elements and all could come in, right? So the sensors infrastructure, we have to think about how many sensors, the quantity, quality of sensors, huge business area and opportunity. The connectivity aspect, this layer in terms of how we are able to have, wireless communication has made things very different because wireless has reduced the material needs for a lot of connectivity infrastructure, but there are limits to that as well, and certainly the routers and so on will also require certain particular kinds of material technologies. And how do we resource those better? And then we need a mechanism to analyze the data, because part of the aspect of smart cities is that there are feedback loops, and the data is coming back to some servers and it's being processed and moving forward. So like in Delaware, we have just established a new big data institute, which is going to work with a lot of the industry partners. We have a similar grant to the one Yale has with the US government, the big $70 million grant that focuses on these kinds of new hubs for American industry. And a lot of our focus is going to be with big data and also with biopharma and how that can be utilized further. So similarly, this will require certain infrastructure around moving things forward. And then finally, automation, digital enabling interfaces for automation. There will be huge livelihood elements to this, which are another story that deserves further analysis in terms of how we deal with the livelihood and development aspects of automation, and more of a social LCA approach that considers that. But this is what we would have to use to do the analysis further. Now, the argument is from smart cities progenitors is that you're moving from less volume to more value. This is a diagram that has been prepared by the British government very recently. They have established a center of excellence at the University of Cambridge that is focused on infrastructure for smart cities. It's the first center of its kind, really, which focuses on civil engineering infrastructure of smart cities. And this is their kind of main talking point, is this pyramid, that we will move towards from less volume to more value, that we will have much less of this and we move more towards that, and we will have improved decisions. But I was surprised, even though it's called infrastructure for smart cities, the physical material needs of this was largely absent. It was more about how do we will just source them and we will build. It's not about asking the question of where will that come from, where will it be mined, are there recycled sources of metal? None of that is absent. And I wrote to the director there last week, in fact, some knighted gentleman who's fellow of the Royal Society and all grand things as they do in the UK. And I said, can you please tell me, have you at all looked at this? And they said, no, actually, no, we haven't. So, it's interesting that even the center with that title has not done so. So the market opportunity is huge, right? So this is the case for the business sector to be more involved in this and to start planning ahead. Because you don't want to be stuck with a situation where already we're in a world where there are trade barriers and commodity tariffs and so on moving forward. And sometimes for good reason. I tend to take a somewhat agnostic approach to making presumptions about some particular politician. There's always some kernel of good value in different points of view, no matter how obnoxiously they might be presented. So if you think about in the case of this whole notion of the need for jobs in America, and one of the motivating factors for these industry hubs, we have to think about this is a huge market as well, and how can we move towards that if this is going to be such a huge transition moving forward? Again, it can be a huge threat if we don't plan for it well, but it can be a major opportunity as well. Now, I also wanted to acknowledge that the material needs may come from cities themselves. And this is where I'm recognizing work of our colleague from Tsinghua, who is with us, Professor Zheng, around. And we've been working together on this. This is very, embryonic right now, but a paper we are developing further and sending out for review soon. But basically, looking at the opportunity for recycled materials, or what is referred to as urban mining, in cities already. And China has done a great job of keeping an inventory and data sets available for this. So we are looking at that could be a potential way whereby the smart city movement could ultimately, if you can think about resourcing those materials from within the urban mine, as it's called, and this term is used, urban mine, as opposed to terrestrial mine, because this is infrastructure which is already there. Basically, this is already this is quite an expansive amount of work that is being done with 30 products and 21 types of capsulated materials. So stay tuned. This is and you should connect with, if you're interested in this work, with Professor Zheng, who's on a Fulbright here for the full year. So I've just put that up there for you to consider, that the recycled aspect of this is one worth considering. When we did our work with the Nature paper last year, we found that for copper, recycled metal will not nearly be enough. It's just not possible, because the demand is going to be so much more that it will not be able to meet it. And we actually looked at recycling forecasts. But for many other kinds of smart city infrastructure, just to transition, it may be possible. So, data like this is going to be important at the global level. Some of the mega cities of the world, China has many mega cities, but we have Karachi, one of the mega cities. The world's largest local municipality is Karachi, Pakistan, and a city of 25 million people, the entire population of Australia in one city. There is no inventory of Karachi or Mumbai or some of these huge mega cities. We do not have a good inventory of the materials that are there. So this is just some preliminary work just to show you that what could happen with China's urban mine, just to show you that, again, but you need good data in order to be able to generate this. So with China's urban mining populations from this research done by Professor Zheng and colleagues, we clearly have huge potential in terms of the different kinds of electronic materials, vehicles, and others, as well as importation. In case of China has been historically quite a bit of importation, but that has been declining. So, and these are the metals that are particularly important, copper and aluminum, as well as plastics, but also indium. So there is potential there that we could come up with some recycled material from within the urban mine. Now, the problem is in China also, and this is the case in many of these, there is a movement, a lot of this branding imperative about eco-cities, and in China they do this lovely branding with harmonies and go back to philosophy of, living in peace with nature and all that. And I visited the Tianjin eco-city plan, and this was actually done partly with Singapore's assistance. But when you get to the material aspects of it, it's not particularly sustainable. And we do not have very good information in terms of these, and they were saying there was a green development at one level was because they said this was like a wetland area, that part of where they were developing it, and otherwise it would have been, not utilized properly. So our conservation colleagues will be quite upset with some aspects of this. So, you have to, even though they're doing a great job in China in many ways in keeping account and collecting data, you still have to be very careful about how the land use actually plays out and what happens. The devil is really in the detail. And so this is just an example that we need to be careful in terms of how we evaluate some of these plans that are presented. So just to try to wrap up, the research agenda moving forward, and I hope to engage with many of you in this moving forward as well. Maybe there will be some opportunities for collaboration. First of all, we have to unpack the material needs for this smart, sustainable cities approach. Much more detailed inventory and demand forecasts, which are absent in many cases. We have to consider terrestrially mined versus urban mined material much better. So terrestrially mined, of course, it continues to dominate, but there has been this resistance of the mining industry, and I've done a lot of work with the mining industry where there is this bravado that, we will always need to mine, and so they don't want to integrate often as well with the recycling industry. Aluminium is an exception, but apart from aluminium, there has been a reluctance on the mining industry's part to think in terms of a more circular economy approach. Thirdly, we need to have a technology options analysis which is based on choices of material availability and comparative impacts of that. So what kind of technologies are going to be developed that will allow for this to move forward? Some of this is being done by groups like the Critical Materials Institute that U.S. Department of Energy has supported in Iowa, but that kind of analysis being done in the urban context for smart urban planning is going to be needed from the point of view of local government, then encouraging policies that allow for waste collection and so on that is targeted, and the technologies that are available to harness that material better then. And then finally, what kind of policy drivers motivate more optimal planning again, the redundancy question is very important, because if you are not able to make use of those changes that are being made in the infrastructure, you end up with, the classic situation, even with great intentions, with the Chinese bicycle problem, the mountains of those shared bikes which were not appropriately used, or actually they were being appropriately used, but people just didn't plan for where they're going to put them at the train stations, and they ended up ending in waste, and many of them new ones too. I still can't figure out why some entrepreneur in China has not figured out a market to get that metal out. It just boggles my mind. They show these drone photographs of mountains of old or new bikes outside Beijing, but that's a tragedy of really not being able to have the right kind of mechanisms to manage those untoward circumstances that arise often in this way. So I'll end with this epigraph from, again, going back to the classics, a great urbanist, Jane Jacobs. Ultimately, it is about the habitants. And, this is where I hope that people in FES appreciate the importance of integration. One of the reasons FES is a place where you don't have departments is that you are forcing some collaboration, I hope, between people who are engineers and technicians and people who work on the social science side. And I've had the great honor to have the epistemic base in both worlds, getting a degree in chemistry and being very passionate about chemistry. I was a TA for Gabe Benoit's class here in chemistry. They thought I was the chemistry guy here, as well as the environmental organic chemistry that I think Shimi still teaches. So that base is very important. But without the social context, it's going to be fruitless. And so this is really a very telling quote from one of the great minds in urban planning, Jane Jacobs, from her book Systems of Survival, that there is no logic that can be superimposed on the city. People make it, and it is to them, not buildings, that we must fit our plans. Thank you. Some questions?
We have some time for questions, and we have microphones as well. So we have a couple microphones. Yes.
Hi, thanks very much. Peter Baird here, PhD student at FES. Just a quick question. I liked your photo from Tianjin, the Eco City. I was there maybe 7 years ago. Mm-hmm. What advice or sets of guidelines are there for city planners who have the good intentions to make an eco city, but to prevent ending up with another big mass of steel and concrete and not necessarily reducing, I don't know, greenhouse gas emissions or material requirements, etc.?
Yes, so the advice I would give in that case is this, there's a convergence point between having an approach that is deliberative and inclusive of the community and a technocratic approach. And unfortunately, cities have not been able to find the good convergence point. Either you have totally deliberative approaches where everything gets just stuck because there is so much deliberation that you are not able to move forward effectively in a timely way, or you have completely centralized planning, which is what has happened in the case of the Tianjin Eco City. And also the technocratic expertise that is brought to bear is very particular. So it is civil engineers with certain viewpoints. So I think what is really needed is that sense of convergence, where you set some clear targets around what will be the kind of expertise that will be needed, what is the level of consultation, as well as negotiation often, which is appropriate. That's one of my doctoral advisor at MIT, Larry Susskind. One of the things he pioneered was how to bring in negotiation into city planning more effectively. And that's the convergence point if we are able to find more effectively. And people are afraid that if you go one way or the other, that you will either sacrifice democratic values on the one hand versus technical expertise on the other. But now I think we have great technical tools to facilitate that. And I'm encouraging people to use, there are companies like Borealis and others who are developing actually tools to get community feedback integrated into systems models, which will be able to more effectively come out with output. So I think if we harness those better, that convergence can be achieved much more effectively.
Hi. Oh.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Yeah, great talk. Thank you. I really appreciate you coming. But I have a question. You made the point a number of times that smart is not sustainable. But unfortunately, that perception is becoming fixed that people think it is, especially with a younger generation where they have a ton of different devices and they've grown up with them from the time they're very little. And I'm just curious if you can address sort of how you undo that, because that perception is really becoming reality for a lot of ways. And I'm curious, based on your understanding of this in such detail, how much of a concern that is.
Yes, so, I think the perception of smart being somehow linked to, so there is this technological supremacy that we deal with constantly, right? So there is a sense that if you are developing a new product, you have a patent, you have some kind of deliverable at the end, there's something superior. I think one has to think about, that's why I also brought up that point of going back, not trying to reinvent the wheel. I mean, you don't need an app for everything. You really need to figure out what is true innovation. You know, in a true innovation, that's what I've been suggesting is that the whole innovation learning process needs to be reconsidered also with children at a younger age. You know, you don't want them to think about necessarily that just building something new is innovation, right? So I think that would help to address your concern. That SMART is a much more integrated concept in terms of bringing in what is already existing and refining it in a way that is most useful. It will have much better uptake. That will probably be the way to go. I mean, but part of it is a branding exercise. You know, you have people, just the term using something as smart, people think that it is somehow appropriate. For me, smart means that you are getting good feedback loops and you are able to use that data feedback to improve. So it's a continuous improvement process. That part of smart, I understand. And I would encourage that. But just having new technology associated with existing infrastructure, that should not necessarily be smart. You know, by just having sensors in everything, and those sensors maybe potentially having material requirements which are not sustainable, may not necessarily be smart.
I think this discussion has been largely very urbanocentric. Mm-hmm. And you've been extolling China because they can do what they want. But one of the things that they have done is deport people from the cities. Mm-hmm. So go back to where he came from. Sounds like we're talking about Mexicans. And we're talking about building walls. Well, I think that's going to cause a lot of Joshuas to come to the front. But you can't think of the city without thinking of the urban resources and the rural resources that are necessary, especially if you follow Jane Jacobs' idea it's the cities, but it's the people, but there are also people surrounding the cities. Mm-hmm. And you see in many developing countries that people are migrating to the cities because the life is better there, even though it may be miserable in, say, Calcutta or Karachi, in the slums. Mm-hmm.
No, I think you're absolutely right. You know, the rural environment, so most of my work, I should note, has been in rural environments before. So it's cities, even though, you know, earlier on I did work in cities, in the last 10, 12 years, I worked in mining areas, and you don't usually have mines in cities. But so I appreciate the importance of some of these rural, like in Australia, I did work with Aboriginal communities, and for them, the focus has been develop mining establishments in rural areas near Aboriginal populations so you can improve Aboriginal economic development. And same with agriculture too, of course, that, you know, you're having agriculture, large-scale agriculture is in rural areas, and that has to feed people in cities. So I think, you know, the population density question is one worth considering. Like, what is the appropriate population density in some rural areas where it is fine to have a smaller population base? There's also, like in Australia, you know, people talk a lot about FIFO, fly-in, fly-out operations, where people are still living in cities and you don't have as much of a workforce need in the rural area, but you optimize resource use by having a FIFO or a DIDO, drive in, drive out, but then DIDO has to be appropriately managed in terms of transport. So I think that's one approach. Singapore is following other approaches in terms of course, self-sufficiency of food production within cities. Qatar has done that, and some of, you know, recent economic embargo from Saudi Arabia, where they were getting most of their food from. They've started to grow, you know, urban food opportunities within Doha. So there are some interesting ways in which people are trying to grapple with it. I do think that the shift towards urban settlement is going to be one which is irreversible down the road, and it's probably at one level a good thing that it is happening in that way. Overall, it doesn't mean everyone will live in cities, but the shift overall from an ecological efficiency perspective will probably be a good thing as long as it can be managed well, with a very important caveat on that.
Yeah, thanks. Saleem, I'd be interested in your reflections on cement, concrete, and sand. And if there's one issue that we could focus on, would it be concrete? I mean, if in the last couple of 100 years we've mastered an extraordinary range of arts and crafts to construct these huge assemblages that we call cities, and the aspiration, coming from South Africa, the aspiration to be modern is really an aspiration to live in concrete. So there's a cultural and there's also a technological dimension. So what's your sense of that space, of where the shifts are? Obviously, alternatives, low CO2 cement, but also there's the standards, ISO standards that basically over the years have been tweaked by the cement industry to the point where you actually can't build almost with anything else. So you mentioned wood. I mean, where are the shifts? Where's the work taking place on that issue?
Yes, no, great question around. I mean, the concrete jungle, as we call the term. Concrete is very much the heart of the city, the contemporary modern city, in terms of material usage. And it's also, in terms of natural hazards, it's a huge problem because, as we know from earthquakes and other kinds of natural disasters, often the fatalities are linked to this very heavy infrastructure that's concrete-based. So finding both the material intensity of concrete and the energy usage and finding better ways of greener concrete, that will continue to be important in some areas like, like airport runways and so on, where we don't really have good alternatives to concrete. But at the same time, looking for alternative habitation systems as well. So, I mean, in the US, clearly, the residential construction is apart from the foundations, is more wood-based than in many other countries. But wood is very expensive in other places. So, I mean, it's part of it is then, yes, wood has a role to play, especially for residential development. And but there isn't really, as far as I know, any good alternative as yet to some of these larger infrastructure uses of concrete, like for bridges, large transport infrastructure developments. And so probably the green concrete movement is the way to go on that. But we do need to think about alternatives, and especially high-risk environments. I mean, I think that when you are rebuilding, say, like, rebuilding after major earthquakes, we need to think about non-concrete residential development. I have been really appalled by some of the reconstruction that has been done after major earthquakes in Southeast Asia has gone back to concrete. And this is a great opportunity to move away from it. So there are those kinds of low-hanging fruit which we should avail of when the opportunities arise.
So I'm not getting the mic because I can all say that I don't
Yep.
Right. But I guess my question is, from what I understand, you're arguing that we should think about what the material needs of technologies that we're going to choose to make cities smarter in the future. And it seems like there's a dynamic component to that that you didn't mention yet, which was resource scarcity, the scarcity of materials, and our idea of what the inventory was should feed back into what technologies we choose.
Yep.
And so I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how you might think or thought about whether it's going the other way. The technologies that we choose to make a city smart will be dictated by resource scarcity.
Great question. We have just submitted a paper to Karen's journal on that topic around how you have this, this notion of feedback between demand and supply centers for minerals. So one of the things we have found is that there is a lag time between development of new technologies and the material needs of those technologies being communicated to the supply centers, right? So you have, for example, with rare earth minerals, we know that this was the case for a long time, that we didn't realize that the demand for rare earths would increase to that degree, nor would lithium, classic one, with lithium batteries, how fast it would increase, that we would have such a major demand need for lithium because those communication mechanisms were not there. In this paper, we have suggested, looking at, particularly we focused on cobalt, which is a very important metal for electric cars, batteries, And it has interesting implications for conservation because the world's largest cobalt reserves are actually under the ocean. Right now, 60% of the world's terrestrial cobalt comes from Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, that is, which is a problem because it's currently a country which is somewhat unstable and has other challenges, though it could be a great opportunity too. So I don't feel we should sanction cobalt from Congo, but we need to figure ways of diversifying supply. So in that, we looked at a model which we've called Smart Mineral Enterprise Development, of how the communication between the technology developers and the mineral companies can be better improved. And we have proposed the role for national labs, for the innovation hubs that would allow for that communication to be improved. So absolutely a critical question. Another way that has been suggested, and this is something, I wrote an op-ed piece on this with some colleagues in Australia for the Conversation. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Conversation. It's sort of an online place for academics to write about op-ed pieces. And we wrote that there should be a global treaty on minerals. We don't have a global treaty. And it would specifically look at that issue. Because one of the problems is that intellectual property laws and secrecy of companies, they prevent you from knowing what is in it, I mean, I did one project for Apple, and the NDA I had to sign for that. I feel I've written my life away on, figuring out what's in an iPhone because they're so secretive about everything, and they didn't even tell us much, even though we were doing research for them. So it's a very real problem. So if you have a global international agreement on minerals, then you would have a mechanism for trust and exchange of that kind of knowledge, which is absent right now. So you get market triggers like this Tesla business. It's ridiculous. Tesla wall suddenly comes up, then lithium prices go through the roof because Elon Musk has made these pronouncements. So very real question, and we're thinking about it. And stay tuned.
So this has been a really great conversation. I want to say that those of you who want to continue this conversation with Saleem, he's actually not going to be here for much longer, but he's coming back in early October because he is a member of the FES Alumni Board.
Yes, yep.
So thank you for kicking off
Pleasure.
our